All right, in Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, we have a this lesson, these three verses belonged in the last lesson, okay? Verses 1 through 18 all pertain to attitudes towards various spiritual disciplines or actions. In verses 1 through 4, there is the attitude in the matter of benevolence. In verses 5 through 15, there is this teaching on prayer that begins with our attitude toward prayer with regard to being seen or doing it to be seen. The words that we might use in prayer with regard to the practices of the heathens. Then the model prayer beginning there in verses 9 through 13. Then the statements that Jesus makes in verses 14 and 15, continuing there's an explanatory statement with regard to forgiveness. If we do not forgive, if we forgive men their trespasses, our Father will forgive us. And if we do not forgive those, then our Father will not forgive us. And so that's all a continuation of that same line of thinking. And then verses 16 through 18 continues that with the matter of fasting, which is a spiritual discipline. But as the text teaches us, and when I say the text, I mean the lesson text. The lesson text teaches us that that fasting was not a part of the old law per se, but it was a practice of those who lived under the old law. There was, for example, the practice of fasting on the Day of Atonement and at other special days in Jewish life. The lesson speaks of humbling themselves or humbling their souls. The King James uses the word afflict your souls, for example, in the Day of Atonement. It doesn't tell us expressly how to do that, or it didn't tell the Jews expressly how to afflict their souls or humble their souls. But the Jews at least took it in part to mean don't eat. Deny yourself and deny yourself in such a way that your denial is ever before you. In other words, when fasting is practiced, it's not practiced for an hour, it's practiced for an extended period of time. And by its very nature, one is continually reminded of it, right? I mean, if you're hungry, you're hungry. And if you're hungry at noon, you're still hungry at 1 o'clock, and you're still hungry at 3 o'clock, and you're still hungry at 6 o'clock. In other words, you might engage in some activity that might temporarily take your mind off that thing, but it's going to be ever before you. You're going to be continually reminded that you are hungry. And so the Jews took it upon themselves to practice fasting, even though it was not commanded of them. And then the lesson teaches us that the Pharisees practiced fasting, at least the one in Luke 18 that Jesus mentioned. By the way, I don't think Luke 18 is necessarily an exact recounting of an actual event. He said 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a publican. And the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. And he talked about the prayer that the Pharisee prayed. Lord, I thank you that I'm not like other men are. And he says, I fast twice a week, and I give tithes of all that I possess. And so the author of the lesson said that it apparently, or was possibly, the practice of the Pharisees to fast twice during the course of a week. But again, I don't know that Jesus is saying that actually happened. In the event, as I think that Jesus is giving us a parable, I think what he's doing is, because we know why Jesus told this told this story. He told it in response and to those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others, and that'd be the Pharisees. And so it may be the case that Jesus was using a slightly exaggerated or hyperbolic example of a Pharisee. In other words, maybe it was the case that there were actually some Pharisees who fasted twice in the week, and they wanted people to know it. But I want us to understand that the Bible does not enjoin fasting, did not enjoin fasting on the Jews. It was something that they practiced of their own free will. And the Bible does not enjoin fasting on Christians. It is a spiritual discipline that we can practice if we are able. Some people cannot fast. Philip Cain is one of them. Any idea why Philip can't fast? He's a diabetic. That's right. And so, it would be detrimental to his physical health to go an extended period of time without taking some form of nourishment. Because he and I talk, we run together a lot, and I know for a fact that there are various times during the day when he's going to eat a bag of nabs. Is that right? Y'all know what nabs are, right? Well, all right. We all know what nabs are. All right. So he's going to eat a pack of nabs at some point during the day to make sure that his sugar levels and his blood levels stay where they are. But can you imagine if he was required to fast? It'd be a problem, wouldn't it? And so the Bible does not enjoin fasting on Christians, but Christians can fast if they so choose to fast. And if they so choose to fast, just like Jesus taught in Matthew 6:16-18, keep it to yourself. If you choose to fast, keep it to yourself. And that was the whole point. And so he's talking about attitudes here. But now I want us to that's why I think verses 6, because it says, moreover, when you fast, don't be like the hypocrites. I mean, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? When you do your alms or do your benevolence, don't be like the hypocrites. When you pray, don't be like the hypocrites. And when you fast, don't be like the hypocrites. And so that's why I think verses 16-18 belonged in the previous lesson, because it's all about attitudes towards things that we can do that are good in and of themselves, but we can turn them into bad things by the attitude that we might have in doing them. All right, so then you get to verse 19, there's a change in direction, there's a change in thought. Jesus begins there in verse 19. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust corrupt and where thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust corrupts and where thieves do not break through and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And no man can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, he'll despise, or love the one, hate the other, despise the one, and love the other. It says, you cannot serve God and mammon. He says, the light of the body is the eye. If your eye is whole or good, your whole body will be filled with light. But if your eye is evil, your whole body will be filled with darkness. And if the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? And then verse 24, no man can serve two masters, concluding you cannot serve God and mammon. I want us to think about those verses just for a little bit. In the three, by the way, your Bible may have them separated into three paragraphs, right? Maybe verses 19 to 21, 22 and 23 together, and then verse 24 set off to itself. That's the way my Bible has them set apart. But let's look at verses 19 through 21 first. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust corrupt and where thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves, or treasures on earth, where moth and rust corrupt, thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not corrupt and thieves do not break through and steal. Let's look first of all at the statement, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on the earth. Now, one thing that has to be understood is this. Jesus is not forbidding us to plan and prepare for the future. Right? In other words, by the way, in most cases in that day and time, most people worked until they died. The idea of retirement was far less common in those days than it is in our day and time. All right? But we do know that people did retire in that day and time, don't we? I mean, Luke chapter 12, there was a farmer, whose farm, his land produced much, and he said, what am I going to do? I'm going to tear down my barns, I'm going to build bigger barns, and what am I going to do? He says, but first of all, I'm going to do what? I'm going to take it easy. I'm going to take my ease. In other words, I don't have to work. I don't have to work anymore. All right? And so we know that the concept of retirement was not totally foreign in the days of the first century. But it wasn't nearly as common now, in that most of us at least expect to retire at some point in time in our lives where we don't have to work. It doesn't mean that we won't work. It means we don't have to work if we don't want to. Or we might do something that we want to do as opposed to what we have to do. Most of us think in those terms. Is that not right? I mean, we all think. All right, so Jesus is not forbidding us. He is not forbidding us for planning for the future. By the way, there are other passages of Scripture that teach us this. For example, Paul said that children are not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. Now, when he says parents are to lay up for the children, he's talking about preparing for the future. And the Bible even tells us, that a man should prepare to leave something not for his children, but for his grandchildren. And so the Bible, what I want to make sure we understand is, I think we do, is that the Bible doesn't forbid us from saving money for the future, preparing for retirement. What he is telling us is that our hopes shouldn't lie there. Our hopes shouldn't lie in what we lay up. I'm of the mind that if God has blessed us enough in order to retire and not have to work, that we probably ought to spend a lot of that time in the Lord's work. I mean, if the Lord has blessed me enough to give me 10 or 15 or 20 years where I don't have to clock in and clock out every day, I ought to take. Let me ask you this: Are the physical blessings that I have at the time I retire, are those from God? They are. Now, is all the extra time that I have from that day forward also a blessing from God? Wouldn't it seem reasonable? Wouldn't it seem reasonable for me to spend more time doing the Lord's work if I'm able to retire than if I had to work if I had to work up until the day I died? And so, even when we're able to retire, we need to consider the blessings that we have, not only in the physical sense, but in the matter of the time that we have, and give that also back to God. Then it says in verse 21, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. I want to think about that passage for a minute. Again, the Bible never forbids us for preparing for the future. In fact, you can read the Proverbs. Consider the ant. The wise man says, consider the ant. What is the ant always doing? He's working. And then there comes a time when the ant can't work, right? But what's he got? He's got a storehouse of food underground to get him through to the spring. And we all know the story of the ant and the grasshopper, right? The ant worked all spring and summer, and the grasshopper fiddled. And then the cold weather came, and what happened? What happened? Grasshopper didn't have none to eat. That's right. And so the Bible teaches us in a number of ways. And by the way, that story I think comes from Proverbs. I think the origin of that is consider the ant, you sluggard. And so the Bible never forbids us from preparing for the future, encourages us to prepare for the future, but also reminds us that whatever we have in this life, no matter what I lay up, it's still corruptible, right? My retirement, my 401k or whatever retirement that I might have can vanish, right? I mean, it can go up and it can go down, and I have to understand those things. But I don't want to put all my eggs in my retirement basket, so to speak. In other words, that's not all I need to think about. And so, but then where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. I'm reminded of a passage that I've used in time past, and that we use a lot, but I think we use it incorrectly. And I'm going to tell you the passage, and then I'm going to start it, and then you're going to finish it for me because you've heard it. In Proverbs 23 and verse 7, the Bible says, as a man thinks in his heart, say it, Dwayne, so is he. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Now, that's true, isn't it? It is true, right? In other words, didn't Jesus teach that in Matthew 15? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. For out of the heart comes what? Adulteries and murders and envyings and all. In other words, all these sins that manifest themselves in our lives all originate in our heart. But let me give you the context very quickly on Proverbs 23 and verse 7. The context begins in verse 6. And the wise man says, do not eat the delicacies of a miser. In other words, if you sit down at a table with a miser, the wise man says, I don't care what he says to you, watch yourself. Watch yourself. Because if he sits down at the table with you and he tells you you can eat whatever you want to eat and however much you want to eat, he really don't mean it. He's watching. The equivalent to that for us would be if I carried somebody out to eat at a restaurant and some of the stuff was average price, but other stuff was pricey. And I told you, order whatever you want on the menu. Order whatever you want on the menu. Now, if I'm an honest individual, then I mean that, right? You can order the $100 steak. If I tell you to order whatever you want on the menu, and I mean it, then you can order whatever you want. But sometimes you know that if somebody says order whatever you want on the menu, you better be looking on the left page instead of the right page. Right? Because he might say it, but he really don't mean it. Right? If you took a girl on a date, and on your first date she ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, that might be your last date. Right? Because it's your first date and she orders the priciest thing on the menu. It's like, oh, wait a minute. I'm getting myself into something here. She don't know me that well. Right? Well, that's what Proverbs 23 and verse 7 is talking about. It's not just talking about as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. It's talking about a man and his attitude toward his treasures. It said a miser. We all know what a miser is, right? From verse 6. An Ebenezer Scrooge. A man who hoards up his money. A man who buries it all in jars in Woolly Swamp. Woodard. All right? Little Charlie Daniels reference for some of you there. All right? And so And so, but it isn't invariably true that whatever is in our heart, or wherever our treasure is where our heart is. All right. So, but Proverbs 23:7 doesn't teach it. It's another one of those passages that sometimes we use to teach what is taught in the Bible elsewhere. But that verse itself is really not talking about that. It's talking about the miser. All right. Now, I want to look at the bottom of page page 1. I didn't make reference to this, and I think we've said enough. 1 Timothy 6:18, Paul makes a charge to rich Christians. And so we know that it's not a sin to be rich. Isn't that right? It's not a sin to be rich. If you think about it, almost all of the great Bible characters were rich. Isn't that right? Was Abraham rich? Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon, Job, that's exactly right. Job, especially so, the wealthiest man in all the East. A lot of the great Bible characters were rich. By the way, there's a sense in which at one time Paul was rich. All the Pharisees were rich. And there was a time when Paul had access to his money, and there was a time when Paul didn't have access to his money. Now, there were times when he had to do without. There were times when he worked with his hands to provide his way there with Aquila and Priscilla. Even among the Ephesians, among the Thessalonians, Paul worked to support himself. But when you get to Acts 28, when he was in jail for 2 years, or in custody for 2 years, he lived in his own hired house. They let him. In other words, rather than having to live in a jail cell, they let him rent. He rented a house in Rome for 2 years. So we know at some point Paul was wealthy. So it's not a sin to be rich. It's not a sin at all to be rich, as long as we don't trust in our riches. Then down at the bottom, there's a statement that if you were going to do a Bible Snopes on it, the result would be partially true. You ever seen that? You do Snopes and it'll say true or false or partially true. Well, the statement that there were no banks such as exist today is partially true. It's not totally true. Now, how do I know that? Well, I know that because in the parable of the talents, the one-talent man was condemned by the master. He says, at the very least, you should have what? Banked it. That's what he says, right? I mean, that's not the words he used, but that's what he's saying, right? At the very least, you should have given my money to the lenders so that I could have received my money back with interest. So that statement of no banks is partially true. There's a sense in which, you couldn't go to a bank in the first century and put your gold in a safe deposit box. Or put it in an FDIC protected savings account, insured up to $250,000, so that if the bank fails, you still don't, you don't lose your money. Yeah, there was no bank in that sense, but there still was a banking system in the first century. All right, and so, but there was no way like we have today to guarantee the safety of our money. Okay, and so I just wanted to make note of that because I just thought the statement was, I think it was overstated. But in the context, maybe not so much. All right. Then at the top of the next page, he says, Jesus is not saying that we should not make reasonable provision for the future, but what he was saying is that accumulating possessions as an end to itself is wrong. As an end to itself. In other words, more and more. Just want more. there's a statement made about a fellow that used to live in this community years and years ago, and he owned quite a bit of property. And what was said of him said he didn't want all the land in the world. He just wanted what? What joined him. Didn't want all the land, just whatever joint. He just wants whatever joins his. And so, in other words, gathering, and that was just said about him. I'm not saying that's the way the man was, or that he thought that gaining land was an end unto itself. My point is that thought probably exists in the mind of many. I just got to get more. I can't ever be satisfied with what I've got. I've got to get more. Now, in verse 22 and 23, the light of the body is the eye. And if your eye is whole, your whole body will be filled with light. But if your eye is evil, your whole body will be filled with darkness. Therefore, if the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? That's a very strange statement, isn't it? And can be difficult to understand. The best way I know how to explain it is this. And this is not a perfect explanation, but it gets the point across. Now, here's what I'm explaining. I'm explaining the statement, if the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? All right, let's say let's say it's not a cold, rainy, dreary day. All right, let's say it's a warm spring day. All right, sun's out. It's very pleasant. We're going to have an outdoor, some type of outdoor festivity, and I'm told, all right, Todd. Now this thing is it's outdoors. And it's semi-formal, so you need to wear a coat, wear a coat and tie, and but wear something that's suitable for spring, something bright, something cheery, okay, something light colored, all right. And I show up in this, what I'm wearing right now. I show up in this, and somebody says, "Wait a minute, we told you to wear a suit, but wear one that's light colored." What if my response was, this is the lightest colored suit I've got? Of all the suits I have, this one's the lightest colored one that I've got. Now, what do you know about the rest of the suits in my closet? What? No, what do you know about my closet if I tell you this is the lightest colored suit I've got? What do you know about my closet? It looks like a black hole, right? If this is the brightest one, my closet looks like a black hole. A goth person would be envious of my closet. All right? That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, if the light that is in you is this, if this is the most light that you've got, then how bad's the dark? How bad's the dark? And what Jesus is saying to us is that what we see with our eyes determines the lightness or the darkness of our heart. If I fill my eyes with darkness, then how dark is the darkness? If I fill my eyes with good things, then my whole heart will be filled with good things, right? If I fill my eyes with good things, even things that I don't think about are still going to be projected from a position of light. Does that make sense? I'm not saying a person ought to be an eternal optimist, all right? Like the little kid digging through the giant pile of manure saying, I know there's a pony in here somewhere. I'm not saying that we have to live our lives as eternal optimists in every situation. There's a time for realism, right? There's a time for realism. But do you know people who their general take on life is positive? That no matter what happens to them, that their reaction is going to be favorable. Right? Do you know somebody that no matter what happens to them, it's always negative? They can't even stand prosperity, right? No matter what happens, tragedy is just around the corner. Then you have people who deal with tragedy, and they say sunshine is just around the corner. That's what Jesus is talking about with how we, how about we say it? How we cultivate our hearts and our attitude in life. We want to be people who respond favorably to bad situations. And when I say favorably, it doesn't mean that I can't admit that things are bad, right? I mean, because sometimes things are bad, right? Sometimes they're just bad. But how do I respond? How do I respond to the bad? Listen, if you're not thinking about Ginger Avery right now, I don't know who you're thinking about. If you're not thinking about Ginger Avery right now, I don't know who you're thinking about. Because from the time this whole thing got started, she never got good news. Not one time. And we talked about this in her service. Freeman and I, mentioned this. Tell me one time when she went to the doctor and got good news. For over a year. Yeah. Now, tell me the one time you ever heard her complain about it. Tell me the one time you ever heard, that she was giving up. I'll tell you when that time was. Never. Never.
You said it's okay, though.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. It's not the news. How many times you hear? How many times we get I can't tell you how many times I got a text from her that said, "Well, I didn't get the news I wanted today. I didn't get the news I wanted today." How's it always end? It's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. That's the kind of heart God wants us to cultivate in ourselves. Not that the sky is always falling, but at some point we believe the sky is going to be blue. It's not going to rain every day. It's going to get better. So how I view the world and the things that I let into my eyes is going to determine my reaction when things are truly bad. Again, just because I'm an optimist doesn't mean that I can't admit that things are bad. So then you get down to verse 24, and we'll close out. No man can serve two masters. He'll hate the one and love the other, or love the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon, or you cannot serve God and riches, money. I thought about this a lot over the last several weeks, thinking about this text and an old statement that a lot of us heard while we were growing up watching movies, especially westerns. You remember this line? This town, what? That's right. Y'all remember hearing that? This town ain't big enough for the both of us. Or this town ain't big enough for the two of us. Right? Now, our hearts are the same way. Our hearts are exactly the same way. Either we'll enthrone Christ in our heart, or we'll enthrone whatever the devil wants in our heart. Just like this town ain't big enough for the two of us, your heart's not big enough for two. And I'll tell you this, Jesus ain't willing to share. Isn't that right? Jesus is not willing to share his seat in your heart with anyone or anything. This heart's not big enough. Jesus says, your heart's not big enough for the two of us. You'll either love me and hate the world, or you'll love the world and hate me. That's just the way that it is. It's just that simple. Can't serve two masters. All right, Lord willing, next week we will do the questions from lesson 29 and move into lesson number 30.